G'day guys, Dean from Blog for the Blood God here, and I've got a little bit of a different video for you today. I was actually able to sit down with Jeremy Martino, who was one of the members of Team Australia in the WTC World Team Championships, and he's just come back from Europe with his gold medal wrapped around his neck, super proud and super keen. So I was able to sit down with him and we had a 2-hour long conversation. We talked about everything from Team 40K to list building for teams, list building for singles and how that differs. We talked about coaching and player development and some of the different strategies you can use to improve as a player. We talked about all kinds of different things, so make sure you watch to the end of this video because there's lots of topics that we touch on, and we sort of just have a free-flowing conversation where we sort of bounce our ideas off each other. I found it really satisfying and really interesting, so I hope you do as well. Make sure you let me know what you think in the comments below. And also, let me know if you'd like to see me do more conversation-style videos like this, where I get various guests on and sit down with them, have a drink, and just chat about 40K and pick the brains of some of the best players in Australia, and maybe even get some international guests as well. Let me know if that's something that you're interested in, or whether you prefer more just the hard tactics and strategy stuff, the Codex reviews, because I'm still in a bit of a developmental stage with this channel. So with that being said, I'll stop boring you with my prattle and we'll get straight into the conversation between me and Jeremy Martino from Team Australia.
Blog for the Blood God.
All right, Jeremy, thank you very much for joining us. For those who don't know, you're a ITC Australian Championship multi-time winner. You've been the captain of Team Victoria when we've won the Australian New Zealand Team Championships. You've just come back from the World Team Championships where you were part of the gold medal Australian team. And most impressively of all, you've recently done a battle report with the #1 ranked ITC Chaos Space Marine player in the world. So there's a very impressive resume. Tell us a little bit about Jeremy, the things that I've left out there, and how you feel that you got to where you are.
Thanks, Dean, and thanks for having me here for today's conversation. My history with competitive 40K, it feels like it's been forever, but it also feels like it's only been a couple of years. But going back and actually looking at it, I think I've been playing since around 2015. So that's about 7 years. Obviously, as a kid, I actually really loved Warhammer as a kid. I remember walking into Warhammer shops when I was probably, 6, 7 years old and just being absolutely infatuated with all the little models and the tables and watching all these people huddling around a table. It just seemed so cool.
Yeah.
And I remember just begging my parents to let me go in, and sometimes they would. And for a large part of my childhood, I remember being dropped off at the Games Workshop store on Friday night, spending a few hours there while my family and my sister and my parents would go and walk around the shops. And that defined a large part of my childhood. But like with a lot of hobbies and a lot of things, I grew past it. I moved on to other things. And then probably around 2015, a group of friends and I were just kind of looking for things to do. And one of my friends said, "Hey, you know about Warhammer?" And I said, "Yeah, of course." And we got back into 40K. So I ended up digging through my garage and digging out models that I had there for almost probably 15 years.
Oh, so you still had your old collection?
I still had I remember these Land Raider Crusaders that had been in their box for probably 15 years.
With the metal side sponsors.
Yep, and so all of that, and that was really cool. And we started playing, and then probably from there, I found the tournament scene. And not long after finding the tournament scene, that's probably when I met you, probably a couple of years into playing the tournaments. And then from there, obviously, I've had varying levels of success. I've had moments where I've done really well and moments where I've, as you said, won the 40K championships. But then I've also had moments where, a year or so have gone by without much competitive success because once again, it's been a bit of a lull, or I've been playing an army that's not particularly strong. So I think it's had that kind of ebb and flow type of feel.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's cool. I think most people have a very similar story, they started it when they're kids. And I think that's how GW get a lot of people.
Well, that's what happened to you, right?
Yeah, for sure. Started it when I was a little kid, and then started with my brother in a little country town. And then, years later, a couple of my mates got back together and we were like, "Oh, what was that fucking game we used to play when we were kids with the little things?" And we're like, "Well, let's look it up." And then you look it up and it's like, wow, it's this huge thing now. And then, jumped into it. And I was from a country town, so when it came to actually playing the game, it was either play against my brother or don't play. But yeah, then moved into Melbourne and I was like, wow, there's actually a whole community of people, and made some of my best friends like yourself just through going to tournaments, meeting people. And I think that's actually one of the areas where if players are looking to expand their skill set and they're looking to get better at the game, I think networking is the single best way to do it. You can watch all the tactics videos in the world, you can watch all the strategy, look at lists online, but it's when you actually start meeting good players and playing against them and testing yourself that you really develop as a player.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that's why there's so many adults in Warhammer. Like, obviously a lot of kids play it and countless kids would collect it and be involved with it. But I think younger people often are a little bit shy about just going up to someone new and saying, hey, do you want to play a game? Do you want to hang out? Like, it's a little bit probably confronting for younger people. But once you're an adult, it's probably a lot more normal to just say, hey, let's meet up at a game store, let's play a game. But there's no reason why younger people can't do that as well. And obviously that, as you said, when you've got a group of friends that are growing together and getting better as players and learning lessons together, eventually, essentially coaching each other. Like, you might not be getting that like top level coaching that people pay good money for, but you will be improving and bouncing ideas around and definitely seeing those ideas turn into real, like, you'll have those ideas that don't work, then you'll have those ideas that kind of manifest into much stronger concepts that really level you up as a player.
I think it's sort of like when you've got a job, right? And you're working with people and you learn skills off the people that you work with, and you teach the people you work with skills. And then you get to a certain point where you've outgrown your coworkers, or you've learnt all you can from that job. So then you take a new job and maybe you go to management, or maybe you go to, like, analysis or something like that. And then you've got a new pool of people and you learn new things. So I think the networking component is a real big thing. Tell us about some of the things where you've felt that you've sort of kicked your 40K skill set into the next level, because obviously some people come into the tournament scene and they really just struggle to break through that first sort of barrier into being competitively competent.
That's a good question. I think one of the biggest things for me that saw me kind of realize a step up in potential, and this was a while ago for me, was when I started playing different codexes, playing different armies.
Yes, absolutely.
Because I remember, like, when I first started, jumped back into 40K, I was obsessed, or I really liked Space Marines. I kind of brought that love of Space Marines that I had as a kid and just kind of started painting up all these different Marine models that I had, either already had or started collecting a whole bunch of new ones. And was playing Space Marines for probably a year or so, maybe a year and a half. And then we actually had a team event. And this was the first team event my group of friends at that time, like, we had. And for a team event, obviously we had a few Marine players. So, and for people that are familiar with team events, almost all team events don't allow you to duplicate factions. Otherwise, you just end up with 4 of the strongest faction versus the other 4. So I remember saying, all right, you take Marines, I'll try something new. And I ended up trying Eldar. And I didn't know much about Eldar at the time. I liked them. I thought they were cool. But I really didn't know much about the way they played. And then I played that team event and I just fell in love with Eldar.
Yeah.
I just remember thinking, oh my God, this is so cool. They're so fast. They do so much damage. They've got all these tricks. And this was back in 7th edition, when you could jump warp spiders around and do all these really cool things, which you still obviously can do with in fact, you can do more now with Eldar. But once I started playing Eldar for a while, and then I was able to contrast the strengths and weaknesses of Eldar with the strengths and weaknesses of Marines, kind of start to work out, well, Marines do this better than Eldar does. So if I'm going to play Eldar, there's no point trying to be really tough.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that I really kind of things started to, like, really twig in my brain, and I felt myself level up. And I think that's around the time I started winning tournaments regularly, around that time.
I think it's really interesting in the way that every faction in 40K has their own personality. And I'm not just talking about in the lore and in the fluff and whatnot. They actually play very differently on the table. So I think a lot of people that are struggling, I think you could almost diagnose it as their playstyle doesn't align with the way that their faction operates on the table. So, like, I used to always play just berserkers and jumping out of rhinos and just pure combat. I was like, no fucking psychic, no shooting. I wouldn't even shoot my bolt pistols. I'm like, nah, I'm just corn and I'm running at you. And then when I started going to tournaments and just getting absolutely smashed my first few tournaments, I was like, this is just frustrating. This is annoying. I was like, what if I try something, a little bit different? And I started putting different elements into my Chaos Space Marines list. And then there was a period there where I was like, well, I'm going to build a Space Marine list and play that. And then I was like, I'm going to build a Tau list. And I built Tyranid lists and Death Watch lists. And like you were saying, the more you do that, the more you find yourself as a player, and you also learn, because now when I'm versing the world leaders, I know what caused me to lose all the time, so I can make sure that I make that happen to my opponent. So yeah, definitely, I agree. Fleshing out your skill set on multiple factions is a really good one. And we know people that have done this. Like, we've had people in our social group that have always played one faction, and then, we've convinced them to play a new faction, and you see them grow. So that's really good advice for people looking to get better.
It also overcomes a kind of, I think, a barrier that people have where it's like an emotional connection to an army. And I think one thing about Warhammer and any kind of strategic game is it really doesn't have room for emotions. Obviously, it has room for, like, when we talk about emotion, I'm not saying you can't love the game, you can't love your teammates and just have that kind of passion. But when you're actually playing the game itself, when you're trying to win a game of Warhammer, there is no room for emotion. There is no room for, well, there is room, but if you're trying to be as good as you can.
Yeah, I would argue that, emotion can be quite the weakness, because if your opponent is able to leverage that emotion, like if you start losing and you start getting really sad because your favorite unit dies and then your morale goes down, then you're more likely to concede points and you're more likely to make those mistakes. So yeah, I think you're right. And if you're emotionally attached to your army, when you start to lose, you actually feel that that emotion much stronger.
Yeah, and it's definitely true. Like, even when you have moments of bad luck, like you might have a moment where you fail a charge, and it's a really unlucky fail. You roll a double 1 or a 1 and a 2, CP reroll it, happens again. And you kind of fixate on that, how unlucky that is. Whereas you might have still been favored to win that game, as even when that charge roll fails. You're still in a winning position. But a lot of people, as you kind of alluded to, they'll take that morale hit and then they'll end up throwing the game.
Yeah.
And I think removing that emotion is really important. But one way to help new players remove emotion is to jump onto an army that they might not love as much as their army that drew them to 40k. Like, they might get drawn to 40k because they love, in your case, Khorne. But then you find yourself playing Tau, and you might have hated Tau. But then when you kind of start playing them, you're like, and I think we've spent hours and hours, hundreds of hours probably talking about 40k lore, but every army in 40k is cool. That's one of the best parts about 40k is every army is awesome. So when you have Tau, then you're commanding Tau, you start thinking, oh, they're pretty cool, but that really emotional tie that was keeping you and bounding you to that Khorne goes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's also something to be said for returning to it, which is what I've been doing recently, because when you're passionate about something, which is part of the emotional, involvement, you dig deeper into that faction and you find things that other people have overlooked. So, when during 8th edition, when I essentially invented pinning, like, I know it was like the wheel, it was invented multiple places, but in our local meta, I was the first person to figure out, holy shit, if I put 3 models either side of you can't fall back, which means you can't shoot my bloodletters, which means they're still there next turn. And then I kill you in your turn. Oh my God, now I have my turn. That realization happened because I just kept forcing the issue. I was just like, no, I'm going to make this faction good. And I just kept forcing it. And if I didn't have the passion and the emotionality attachment to that faction, I may have never done that. I may have just gone, you know what, Tau is way easier. You just build a castle and you just sit there and you just don't have to fucking think. So there is something to be said for the emotional attachment as well. But I think the trick is you've got to be, flexible with it. You don't have to get rid of the emotion, but you have to sort of spread it. I think
for example, on Team Australia, one of our most defining elements of the Australian team is we really value faction mastery.
Yeah.
And we always trust, and Eric, the captain, for example, and the whole team in general has had a philosophy of trusting players.
Yes.
Not telling players what they have to do and treating players like just moving objects and weapons that just get ordered around. In Australia, the players make the team, and we as a team have like great faction masters.
Yeah.
Eric himself is, he for people that obviously have been following the WTC, he went undefeated with GSC with this really wacky list that nobody knew what it did.
Yeah.
And he knows what it does because he sits there reading the book all the time. He's thinking, it's marinating in his brain all the time.
Yeah.
He's playing something and willing to invest in something that other people discarded within a couple of months of the codex coming out.
Yeah.
And that's allowed him to get to that stage.
Yeah, well, that's sort of like what I did with Chaos Space Marines before the new codex. You know, the old codex, everyone was like, Chaos Space Marines are garbage. And I was like, no, I think there's something here. I think, you know, something with the Noise Marines and the Terminators, like we sort of, you know, we workshopped that list together, but going through that over and over, and when you rock up the table, you're at a 200 player event and you're the only Chaos Space Marine player and nobody knows what the fuck Chaos Space Marines do. And then your Noise Marines go in and just absolutely blow their mind. So there is something to be said for being that off-meta faction master as opposed to just going on to Goonhammer and downloading the latest, you know, hot shit.
Yeah, and it also allows for, you know, when you're playing a friend that's very intimate with their army and they know it very well, you obviously then start to know it as well. You get to learn it as well. So it's not just a cursory glance where you play someone at a tournament that's playing, you know, Custodes or playing Sisters or whatever it is, and you're just playing someone that's only just encountered the army, and you're playing like the meta, scraping the top of the meta element of the army.
Yeah.
So you get to see what Retributors do, you get to see what Repentia does. It's not about that. It's when you play someone that's a faction master, you get to see their tricks. And I remember, to go back to your story about the pinning, in 8th edition when you came up with that, and as you said, I'm sure obviously all around the world people were working that out, but in our little scene, when you did that, it totally changed the way that I realized 8th had to be played. I was like, okay, this is what people are doing. You can't just, and at that time I was running Eldar, and Eldar had, I think, were just about to get their codex. And when Eldar did get their codex, I started realizing, well, it's not possible to play this edition, even if you're playing an army that wants to shoot people, which Eldar kind of did. You also definitely need strong combat.
Because you need to be able to dig
dig yourself out of pins. You can't stop people from pinning, you know, your forward deploying things or whatever it might be, but you need to be able to dig them out in combat. And that actually led to me evolving that version of that Yannari list. And people will remember Nick Nanavati winning the LVO with a really cool Yannari list that had spears and it had reapers. And I pretty much concurrently with Nick Nanavati, like obviously we weren't in communication. Like he was on the other side of the world with his group of mates. But at our version of LVO at CanCon, which happened just before LVO, I turned up with essentially the same list.
Yeah.
Because it kind of, I worked out, okay, the Reapers are really good. You know, there's certain other elements of the army you need. You need a bit of MSU, but you also need these Shining Spears because you have to be able to dig yourself out of pins.
Yeah.
And that wouldn't have evolved unless your evolution had happened.
Yeah, so it's one of those things where it's sort of a bit of a chain reaction where one person's evolution, if you play with that person regularly, that will trigger evolutions in you. And then that evolution in you is probably going to trigger evolutions in other people. So getting a group of competent mates together is really good. That being said, I think there's also something to be said for, and this is something I did early on and I'm so glad I did, is when I go to a tournament, I look at the people on those top tables and I try to make friends with them. Because if you just have your little gaming club and you're the best player in your club, but you still come 50th out of 100 players, well, I'm not saying get rid of your gaming club mates, but you should probably try to socialize with those other players because then you might get games at their house. And when you play somebody in their house, you learn so much more than when you play them at a tournament. Because at a tournament, they're not going to tell you their tricks. And they might not even deploy half of them, you know, because they might not need to in that situation. Whereas you play them at home and they're like, oh, well, just so you know, if you do that, I'm able to do this, this, and this. And you're like, wow, I just learned something. So
that's really, yeah, definitely. And that's great advice, I think, to people when you're at a tournament. Like, just network with the people that if you're really impressed by someone and you have a great game against someone, why not organize to meet up with them for a game?
Yeah.
Essentially, you're getting free coaching. And I remember when, you know, in the past, when we've had people, fledgling players in our scene, like in the Victorian scene, I've been approached for coaching before by people, and I'm pretty busy with my private life. And I've kind of said to people, look, don't worry about coaching. Just come and play. Just come and hang out at Dean's place, because obviously you often host hobby nights, and we'll play. Just come and play with us.
Yeah.
Don't worry about coaching. Just come and hang out.
Yeah.
And I think that's an organic way for everyone to grow and everyone to build together.
Yeah, 100%. And you'd be surprised what those people can bring, because it's one of those things where, like, you know how like diversity breeds innovation, right? Well, one of those things is if you bring somebody new into your gaming club, well, they might have a trick that they do in their gaming club that your club hasn't figured out yet, you know? So bringing them in it's only ever a good thing, really.
Yeah.
Whether you're the new person coming into the more experienced club, or whether you're the experienced club bringing in somebody new, either way, fostering those relationships is a huge way to grow as a player.
Definitely, and I think that also applies like cross metas as well. Like obviously, you've got clubs in a scene like Victoria, lots of little clubs playing, or wherever you are in the world. But even nationally, like in terms of Australia, we have like really strong communities that are quite separated by quite a bit of distance. Like, you've got like the Victorian community, you've got the community in Queensland, which is typically Brisbane Central. You've got New South Wales community that have quite strong hubs within broader New South Wales. And those communities don't necessarily meet all the time.
Yeah, there's only like probably maybe 2 or 3 events a year.
They're the big ones.
Where you'll see the people from Queensland will fly down to Victoria, or, the people from Victoria will do the drive or fly up to, Maitland or one of the, Sydney events. So,
yeah, and you do see like lists and ideas and themes like percolate in a specific community, but then when they're exposed to a broader meta, those ideas have to be refined.
Yeah.
And then they get better. And I think that's a really strong part about the Australian community is we're a small country in population, but we've got really strong locuses of play that meet semi-regularly. Like, we've got those 2 to 3 big events a year, but then we have another few smaller events. And because we kind of regularly meet, it's fostered a situation where you have these, like, the best of both worlds. You have innovation happening separately, but then it's coming together to fuse a few times a year, and then that's led to us obviously having a very strong scene within the country.
Yeah, so that actually leads into one of the things that I wanted to ask you was, so obviously Australia went and did absolutely fantastically this year and won the WTC. The previous time that we went, we came 4th, which is also an amazing result, played off against England for the win, so that's a really strong result as well. What is it that you think makes the Australian team so strong?
It's a great question, and I think what I found and why I love the WTC and really loved attending it both times I've been is that you realise how loved 40K is around the world. And when you see all these national teams walk into the hall, all with their own their gear on, like I've got on now, you realise, wait a second, this is a worldwide community. And this year we had 27 countries, 28 teams. We had the mercenary team and 27 countries. But I was talking to Neil Kerr, who's one of the organisers, and he was mentioning that they had lots of other teams slated to come that couldn't come because of kind of ongoing COVID issues.
Yeah.
We've got teams from Asia that are marshalling now. Teams like from Japan, Vietnam, China, all around the world. There's a lot of South American teams that couldn't come because COVID's still creating big issues in South America. And it's a global community, and walking in and seeing that like passion, where you've got these great teams all together, makes you appreciate, wow, it's not just us that are good.
Yeah.
All these teams are crazy good. There's like any of those national teams at the event had superstars that when I say nobody, I mean people from other countries don't know who they are. They're people that aren't kind of necessarily known players that are blogging in the English language for, American and Australian and English audiences to view, or worldwide English-speaking audiences to view. And it's quite humbling to experience that. But to go back to your question about why is Australia good? I think it's a couple of reasons. I think kind of going back to what I said before, we were fortunate in that we do have a scene. The way our country is set up allows the meta to kind of clash regularly enough that we're able to come up with really unique, cool ideas. But I also think we happen to, due to some great team building over the last 3 to 4 years since the lead up into the 2019 WTC, come up with a really strong squad of players that were able to retain all the way through COVID, which was obviously a horrible time for 40K.
Yeah.
Anyone that's watching this would be able to relate to the fact that 40K is a social hobby.
Yeah, primarily,
It's you really want to be around the community you're playing with. You can play on TTS, you can meet up on Discord and talk. You can do all these, and it is conducive to, you remember when during COVID, we were doing paint streams. Like, remember we were doing calls?
Yeah, literally we'd have like the Zoom call and there's like 50 screens up on there and we're all just painting like
and
that
like
thing where we swapped a mini with each other. We like posted a mini to each other to paint. Yeah, so it's good for that social element.
We were doing things like that, but at the end of the day, it wasn't the same. So we were able to team build in a way that, and this is a credit to Pete Platel, the previous captain, but Eric Lathuris, the captain for this whole time through COVID.
Yeah.
And Eric's done such a great job of making sure that we've got the strongest players in Australia getting along, kind of coalescing together with the same goals. So I think we could say, I think it would be, to reiterate, I think it's the team building element that made our team the strongest.
I actually think one of my theories, and this is a bit pie in the sky, but one of my theories is the tall poppy syndrome, which is really, really prevalent in Australia, which is basically for those who don't know, it's when instead of emulating the heroes of your culture, you actually try to cut them down. As soon as somebody rises too high, instead of championing them, you chop them down. And I think what that does is it creates fierce competition in Australia, where somebody from Brisbane might be like, I'm the best player, and somebody from, Victoria is like, well, no, I'm the best player. And since they don't get to meet often, both of them have a lot of legitimacy to that claim until the time that they do meet. So when they do meet, it's this epic fight. And also, part of it is that if somebody's doing well with a list, you see a lot of hesitancy for people to copy that list. People be like, oh no, that his list is bad, he's just winning because of X, Y, Z. And they come up with their own thing. So I think because we don't emulate, that gives us a really deep field for innovation and allows us to come up with, more rapid innovation. So when the meta shifts, we shift faster than it, sort of thing.
That's an interesting it's hard because it's true. Like in Australia, we do have tall poppy syndrome, and we do in 40K have a lot of very prominent players that rarely are playing the same list.
Yeah.
You rarely see the top, or any of the top 10 players all playing the same meta list. It just doesn't happen in Australia.
Yeah.
Not necessarily saying it always happens, but there's a lot of times where you'll look at a tournament scene around the world and everyone's playing the top army at the time. So something like at the moment it might be something like Leviathan Tyranids or Adeptus Sororitas or whatever it might be. Crons, that doesn't happen in Australia. People don't just shift and I think one reason for that is, and this kind of is another probably reason, is the emphasis in Australia on the ATC, which, obviously the Americans have their American, their team championship. I'm not sure exactly what ATC stands for in America.
I think it's just the American team challenge, which we have the Australia and New Zealand team challenge.
Yeah, so
ANZTC.
Right, so we have the ANZTC, the Australia New Zealand team championship. And for anyone that's not aware, it's basically like our version of the WTC, right?
Yeah.
Instead of having 28 countries or whatever, we have just the 8 states, or that, normally we get between 6 and 8 teams, and we have our own version of WTC. And that really, really, really helps us in the competitive communities understand the nuances and the specifics of team competition.
Yeah.
And I think because of, for example, Team Australia's focus on all the way from when we kind of played off for the win against England in 2019, it was quite bitter, the loss. It felt great to be there. It felt amazing to play off for the win. But we all kind of left there with a hunger to come back again.
Yeah.
And as soon as the event ended, we all
a bit of a tease.
Yeah, we all pretty much reprised. We're like, you know what, let's do this again. And then we got teased over the next few years. But what that means is that when players are preparing for events, like for example, myself, I've been playing Sisters for the last year and a half or so. And even when Sisters were not anywhere near top of the meta, obviously they kind of are now.
Yeah.
But prior to that, when they were just a B or C tier codex, I was still playing them because that was my team list.
Yeah.
So, I knew that someone else was going to be playing Space Marines. Someone else was going to be playing Tyranids. Someone else was going to be playing Drakari or Eldari. Yeah. So I was like, well, my little nook, the thing that I've got is Sisters. I'm going to reiterate and just innovate with Sisters. And I was able to develop a very unique way of playing Sisters that kind of was different to what the main meta was playing.
Yeah.
So it allowed me to bring a different version of the army that had quite a bit of success within the event.
Yeah, I remember every time I'd get to an event and I'd get paired into you and your sisters, I was always just like, God damn it, because no matter what I plan, I know that you have like 3 or 4 plans that will all sufficiently counter me. Just the way you were able to use the miracle dice to string out objective secured models and deny my primary and just all the different shenanigans that you had. You can only really get that if you play a codex for a couple of years. You know, you can't just pick up a codex, read it, and go, oh, I know all the tricks. You know, you have to keep at it. You have to keep trying all the different stuff. You have to keep getting into situations, and then because we always have this, like you'll lose a game and you'll be like, oh, if I only just did that, I should have done that on turn 2 and that would have won. If you keep doing that over and over, eventually all of those lessons that you've learned accumulate, and you then don't make those mistakes. Whereas if you faction hop too frequently, like I know we were saying earlier, it's really good to try out different factions. But if you faction hop too frequently, and if you just go, whatever's the top medalist, I'll just play that, you never really develop that deep sort of, you know, understanding of what the faction can do.
Yeah, I think it's like a sense of responsibility. Like I think it's easy when you lose a game to blame everyone except yourself. To say, oh, it was the dice fault. It was my dice betrayed me, or you know, it was the mission I was playing on. Or my opponent just got lucky.
Yeah.
Or I just had a bad matchup. I ran into a red.
Yeah, or my favorite, oh, my opponent cheated.
Yeah, like, you know, and that's the magic cheating accusation, all those things. But one of the hardest things to admit in life in general is that I stuffed up. I made a mistake. If I just did this differently, even though I was into a red, even though I did get a bit unlucky, if I just did that instead, and I played better, maybe I would have won. And I think it's really, a lot of people really struggle with that. And I think it's just a life lesson. Like it applies to all parts of life where people go through life, they encounter adversity, and rather than take responsibility for some of the issues that they encountered along the way, they try to attribute blame to the easiest thing they can.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I got significantly better as a player when I had that realization, you know. And I think a lot of people are way too quick to blame luck. And in my opinion now, after having learnt that lesson, I've realized that if the dice fuck you, well, you probably shouldn't have put yourself in a position where bad dice were going to fuck you, right?
Yeah.
You can't always avoid it, right? But for example, if you deep strike something and go for a 9-inch charge and fail, like you can't blame the dice. Even if you CP reroll it. Even if it's a 7-inch charge and you CP reroll it. It's like, if you were hinging your entire game plan on making that 7-inch charge, you fucked up. Doesn't matter what the dice are.
Yeah.
You shouldn't have been that heavy leverage. And this is why I always get triggered with people when they math hammer out their damage, you know? And they go, okay, cool. You've hit me with, 10 wounds. I have a 4-up save. So therefore, I should only fail 5 and therefore I should survive. And then they fail 6 and they die. And then they claim, oh, I got unlucky. And it's like, well, why did you expose a unit that was going to die if it rolled slightly worse than average? You know, you should have been more protective of that unit, or, or in the inverse, if they pass one more save than they mathematically should have, and you're like, no, it should have died. It's like, well, maybe you should have allocated more damage into it to make sure that it died.
Yeah, I think one reason, and that's one, and a kind of the obviously conversation shifting to the kind of common weaknesses or issues with newer players. I think a bad understanding of statistics is a common problem for players where they don't really understand probability very well. And because of that, it does mold their decisions in a way that isn't really accurate.
Yes.
And I think it's probably worth people, obviously you don't need to be a mathematician. Like we have mathematicians playing. Like Chris Wright is one of our best players and he came along to WTC and, won it with us. He's essentially a mathematician.
He's effectively a calculator.
Yeah, he's crazy with maths, but you don't need to be Chris Wright, but you do need to understand some general ideas of what a bell curve is, about standard distribution, and statistics can be kind of often the human brain doesn't quite what's the word? Some things don't seem intuitive, but they just are like that. I remember there's this interesting paradox, something like if you have 26 people in a room. What do you think the chances are that 2 people have a birthday on the same day?
Okay.
And it's called the birthday paradox.
Yeah.
And it was interesting because I did this paradox, actually, I was in a room with 26 people. So it actually happened to be, when I was talking about it, it was really interesting. But what do you think the chances are?
Quite low.
Well, how? 26 people in a room, exact birthday, like, you know, of the year
as well.
of the year. No,
Okay,
not the
so
same year.
Same day, same month.
Same day, same month.
Okay, so you got this 352
Yeah.
potential days.
Yeah.
You got 26 people. So it's tiny. It's got to be like, I don't know, 10%, something like that.
It's 50%.
What?
Yeah. It's the
Okay.
birthday. So that's essentially that's a really good way. The birthday paradox is a really good way to explain how the human brain often doesn't quite, like, things that seem like they should be a certain way aren't.
Yeah.
So, like, the analogy in 40K is like what you said. Like, people will be like, oh, well, I made this mistake at WTC. Like, this is the thing, like, even good players can fall for statistical issues. Like, I made a mistake when I was playing John Lennon, and
I hope you guys enjoyed that conversation as much as I did. That was just the first half an hour of a 2-hour-long conversation between Jeremy and I that we go on about a whole bunch of more really interesting stuff in that second half of that video. So if you want to see the rest of it, all you have to do is sign up to my Patreon. It's $1 a month, and that'll gain you access to the rest of this exclusive Patreon video, as well as many more videos to come. I'm going to try as best I can to keep most of my stuff in front of the paywall and free for everybody on YouTube. However, I do want to do something to show my Patreons how much I appreciate their support. So what I'm going to be doing is every now and then I'm going to take one of these longer videos and I'm actually going to split it in half. First half will be available for free, and then the second half will be available behind that Patreon paywall. Now, when I say paywall, it is only $1 per month to get access to this. So it's only 25 cents a week. You'll barely notice it. However, if enough people do that, it's going to be able to provide me with the money that I need to increase the quality of my content, to pay to get better guests on, to get more battle reports done, and all of the things that you guys love about this channel, I'll be able to do better, bigger, and more often if I can get that support on Patreon. So thanks again for following. Thanks for liking, subscribing, putting your comments below. That's always great. I love the conversations that we have in those comment threads. And also, thank you to all those who already support me on Patreon. It means a lot to me. It really does inspire me to do this, and I couldn't do it without you. So thank you to my Patreons, and I look forward to sharing this with you guys if you do just decide to join us over in Patreon. So thanks again. I really appreciate it, and I'll talk to you guys soon.
Look for the blood god.
Do your objective markers ever get lost behind terrain or other models and become difficult to see? Do they ever get bumped and accidentally moved during a game? And do they ever spark arguments about distances? Well, not anymore. Introducing the blog for the blood god, not even remotely patented neoprene objective markers. Made from the same material as astronaut suits, or maybe military equipment, or probably neither of those things, this 2mm thick neoprene synthetic rubber is tear resistant, water resistant, and is designed to last. But that's not all. The blog for the blood god, not even remotely patented neoprene objective markers come in a variety of different designs and styles to suit any faction represented in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. These objective markers are a perfect gift for yourself or a friend, and are a perfect way to flex and show your opponent that not only are you a smarter, cooler, and better 40k player than them, but you also have more disposable income than they do. For the low price of $25, you'll get not one, not two, but 6 neoprene objective markers, perfectly designed for 9th edition Warhammer 40k. But wait, there's more. For a limited time only, people who sign up on Patreon to support Blog for the Blood God as a Skull Champion tier $5 per month member will gain access to a custom design service where I will design a unique logo to support their gaming club, like the one I did to the left here for the Potato Farmers local gaming club here in Melbourne. Follow the links in the description of this video to pick up your set today.